My article in the Africa Report is Debt, Virus and Locusts Create a Perfect Storm for Africa. The year began with promise for sub-Saharan Africa. All the major institutions tracking African growth said so. The African Development Bank pronounced in its economic outlook in January that Africa's economic outlook continues to brighten. Its real GDP growth, estimated at 3.4% for 2019, is projected to accelerate to 3.9% in 2020 and to 4.1% in 2021. The IMF said in its World Economic Outlook, sub-Saharan African growth is expected to strengthen to 3.5% in 2020 to 2021 from 3.3% in 2019. The World Bank predicted regional growth is expected to pick up to 2.9% in 2020. Interestingly, the World Bank added a caveat, which was prescient. A sharper than expected deceleration in major trading partners such as China, the Euro area or the United States would substantially lower export revenues and investment. A faster than expected slowdown in China would cause a sharp fall in commodity prices, and given sub-Saharan Africa's heavy reliance on extractive sectors for export and fiscal revenues, weigh heavily on regional activity. Those forecasts are now defunct, and it's only March. The coronavirus has to date barely made landfall on the African continent, with only 5 countries at the time of writing reporting infections, but a virus is in its essence non-linear, exponential and multiplicative, and it would be a Shakespeare-level moment of hubris if policymakers were to pat themselves on the back. Diagnostic kits were only recently availed, and if South Korea tested the same number of people as the entire African continent, they would be reporting single-digit cases. We all know now what exponential disease propagation looks like in the real world. Real-world exponential growth looks like nothing, 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 then cluster, 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 then boom. And therefore, we will know soon whether we really have dodged the coronavirus infection bullet. The issue at hand is now around the violence of the blowback from the China coronavirus feedback loop phenomenon. The virus is not correlated to endogenous market dynamics, but is an exogenous uncertainty that remains unresolved and therefore is a black swan. Fantasy predictions of a V-shaped recovery in China have been dashed. In fact, China cannot just crank up the factory because that will risk a second-round effect of infections. Therefore, I expect GDP growth through the first half of 2020 in China at 0 or negative as my base case. Standard Bank's chief economist had calculated that a 1 percentage point decrease in China's domestic investment growth is associated with an average 0.6 percentage point decrease in Africa's exports. Do the maths. Those countries heavily dependent on China being the main taker of their commodities are at the bleeding edge of this now negative feedback loop phenomenon. Commodity prices, crude, oil, copper, coal have crashed more than 20% since the start of the year. You don't have to be a rocket scientist or an economist to calculate which countries are directly in the line of fire. Angola, Congo, Brazzaville, DRC, Equatorial Guinea, Zambia, Nigeria, and South Africa spring immediately to mind. Notwithstanding comments by the always upbeat and bright-eyed President Adesina of the African Development Bank that Africa is not facing a debt crisis, he told Bloomberg, debt is not a problem, it's very bad debt that's a problem. The point is this. Sub-Saharan African countries, with no exception that I can think of, have gorged on borrowing and balance sheets are maxed out. Africa's sovereign issuance in the Eurobond market totaled $53 billion in 2018 and 2019, and total outstanding debt topped $100 billion last year. Debt burdens have increased and affordability has weakened across most of sub-Saharan Africa, while a shift in debt structures has left some countries more exposed to a financial shock, said Moody's last year. Very few of the investments made are within spitting distance of providing a return on investment. Rising debt service ratios are best exemplified by Nigeria, where the government is spending more than half of its revenue servicing its debt. More than 50% of SSA GDP is produced by South Africa, Nigeria, and Angola. South Africa reported that GDP in Q4 2019 shrank by a massive 1.4%. Annual growth at 0.2% is the lowest yearly growth since 2009, and the tape is back at GFC times. The rand, which has been in free fall, has a lot further to fall in 2020. And this is before the viral infection. Nigeria's oil revenue is cratering, and there is $16 billion of hot money parked in short-term certificates, which is all headed for the exit as we speak. A currency devaluation is now predicted and predictable. South Africa, Nigeria, and Angola are poised to dive into deep recession. East Africa, which was a bright spot, is facing down a locust invasion, which according to the FAO could turn 500x by June. It is practically biblical. If I shut up heaven that there can be no rain, or if I command the locusts to devour the land, or if I send pestilence among my people. 2 Chronicles. This is a perfect storm. Buckle up and let's stop popping the quaaludes. Here you see medical staff wearing protective gear at a new section specialized in receiving anyone who may have been infected with coronavirus. This is the Quinquini Hospital in Douala, Cameroon. As I said, on the 24th of Feb, we're past the point of no return on this coronavirus issue. I did an interview with Radio 702 where I spoke about my extreme concerns about coronavirus making landfall. Nothing, 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 cluster, 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 and then boom, that's epsilon theory. As I said on the 27th of January, I have to assume that the virus is already in Africa, but just not diagnosed. That's a racing certainty. According to the information I have, Ethiopia, for example, has so far tested 23 cases. On average, 1,500 passengers per day arrive from China and Ethiopia.